Is anyone there? Nina Walker froze in the middle of the empty road, her breath catching when she saw the black SUV upside down against the guardrail, glass scattered everywhere, smoke curling from the crushed hood. Then she heard it, a weak, broken breath from inside. Her heart slammed. He was alive. "Oh my God," she whispered, dropping her bag and running to the wreck. Inside, a man was pinned beneath the twisted frame, blood running down the side of his face. He looked half dead already, broad shoulders trapped. One arm crushed under metal, his chest barely rising. Nina's panic hit all at once. "No, no, no." She knelt beside the shattered window, hands shaking. "Please don't die, please." His eyelids twitched. That terrified her even more. He was alive enough to feel this. Hey, stay with me," she said quickly, leaning closer. "Can you hear me? Don't close your eyes." His eyes opened a fraction, dark and glassy with pain. Good, bad, she did not know. She only knew she had seconds to keep him conscious. Nina grabbed the bent edge of the frame and pulled. It did not move. She gritted her teeth, braced one foot against the pavement, and pulled harder. Nothing. The smell of gasoline drifted into the freezing air. Panic shot through her chest. "Come on," she gasped, looking around wildly. No cars, no people, no help, just her. She spotted a jagged metal bar near the guardrail, snatched it up, and jammed it under the crushed door frame. With both hands, she forced her weight down. The metal shrieked. The man groaned. I know, Nina said, almost breathless with fear. "I'm trying. Just stay awake for me." The frame shifted just enough. Nina threw the bar aside, reached in, and hooked one arm under his shoulders. He was heavy, far heavier than she expected, and half his weight was still caught in the wreck. She pulled once. Nothing. Again, a scrape, a small shift. "There you go," she said, voice trembling. "That's it. Help me. Come on." His head rolled weakly toward her. Blood darkened his collar. He tried to speak, but only a rough sound came out. "Don't talk," Nina said. "Save it. Just breathe." She planted both feet, clenched her jaw, and dragged with everything she had left in her. With a violent scrape of metal and fabric, his shoulder tore free. Both of them crashed onto the pavement. Nina sucked in a breath, then looked down at him in shock. He was still alive. His chest rose again, shallow but real. For 1 second, relief nearly made her cry. Then his eyes opened. "Stay with me," Nina cried, her hands shaking as she pulled him from the crushed car. "You don't get to die here. Do you hear me? Wake up." She grabbed his coat, pulling him farther from the SUV. "Look at me," she said, louder now, forcing strength into her voice. "You're not dying on this road. Not tonight. Stay awake. Stay with me." His gaze found her face, unfocused but stubborn. Like some part of him was still fighting. "That's right," Nina said quickly. "Keep your eyes open. Breathe. Nice and slow." He winced, struggling for air. "You're okay," she lied. "I've got you. Just don't pass out on me." He looked at her like he was trying to understand why she was there at all. Nina barely noticed the blood on her hands now. Her whole body was shaking from adrenaline and cold. "My name is Nina," she said, leaning closer so he could hear her. "You don't know me, and that's fine. But you listen to me, all right? Help is coming." His lips moved. She bent lower. "What?" Only a broken rasp. "Doesn't matter," she said quickly. "Don't talk. Just stay with me." The SUV hissed behind them. Smoke kept rising. Nina dragged him another foot across the freezing pavement, away from the wreck, every muscle in her body burning. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, don't do this." His eyes fluttered. "No." Her voice sharpened instantly. "No. Don't you do that. Look at me." She put one hand against his cheek, cold skin under blood. "Stay awake," she said, firmer now. "You made it out. Don't quit now." For a moment, his eyes opened wider. He looked straight at her. There was something hard in his face, even broken and bleeding like this, something dangerous, powerful. The kind of man ordinary people crossed the street to avoid, but right now he was just a dying stranger, and Nina refused to let him slip away. "That's it," she said softly, her own breathing ragged. "Keep looking at me." In the distance, sirens finally cut through the night. Nina almost sobbed from relief. "You hear that?" she asked. "That's for you. So stay awake long enough to let them take over." His lips parted again. This time, one word came out, rough and torn. "Nina." Her eyes widened. He had heard her. "Yes," she said at once. "Yes, that's right." His head shifted slightly. Then his body went heavier against the pavement. "No, no, no." She tapped his shoulder. "Hey, stay with me. Don't you dare." She pulled off her coat and shoved it under his head, then kept talking. Faster now, afraid silence would let him sink under. "You're going to be fine," she said. "You're going to wake up in a hospital and hate every second of it, but you're going to live through this. Do you hear me?" Red and blue lights flashed across the road. Paramedics rushed in. Police shouted questions. Nina moved back, breathing hard, hands covered in blood, knees scraped raw. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, she stared 1 second longer than she should have. Then she picked up her bag, wrapped her torn sleeve around her bleeding hand, and stepped away from the wreck. She did not hear the name spoken when men in dark coats arrived moments later. Adrian Morelli. She did not know the stranger she had dragged from death was one of the most feared men in New York. She only knew that when she found him, he was still alive, and for one terrifying, breathless stretch of winter road, his life had rested entirely in her shaking hands. Comment below where you're watching from, and if this story touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable stories. Adrian Morelli woke to pain before he woke to light. It came in layers, a brutal throb behind his eyes, a sharp pull in his shoulder, a crushing ache along his ribs every time he tried to breathe too deeply. Somewhere nearby, a machine kept a steady rhythm, calm and indifferent, as if pain were just another number to monitor. He opened his eyes. The room was dim, expensive, and private. Not a hospital floor open to strangers and noise. This was controlled space. Thick curtains, clean walls, one leather chair near the window. A vase of white lilies someone had probably thought appropriate. Security first, comfort second. Exactly the kind of place his men would choose. A doctor stood near the end of the bed, flipping through a chart. Gray-haired, neat, annoyingly calm. "You're awake," the doctor said. Adrian tried to sit up. Bad idea. Pain tore through his side so fast and hard that his vision blurred. He stopped, jaw tight. 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, deep lacerations, and a concussion, the doctor said. "You're fortunate." Adrian turned his head slowly. "Fortunate." The word came out rough, half growled. The doctor did not flinch. "Yes, another few minutes in that vehicle and we'd be having a very different conversation." The door opened. Marco stepped in first, large and silent, followed by Leo, whose face still carried the strain of a man who had not slept. Both men wore dark suits, and the look of people prepared to kill before breakfast if required. The doctor closed the chart. "No stress for the next 24 hours. Adrian looked at him. The doctor sighed. "Fine. Minimal stress." When the room cleared, Adrian turned his attention to Marco. "Talk." Marco came closer. The vehicle was recovered. Preliminary look says the brake line was cut. Adrian's face hardened, though not much about him had been soft to begin with. "So it wasn't the road?" "No." "Or weather?" "No." "It was done." Marco nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled over the room. Adrian stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Not because he was shocked, but because he was not. Men like him did not build power without also building enemies. What mattered was not that someone had tried. What mattered was how close they had gotten. Leo spoke next. "Your route was changed late." Adrian shifted his gaze toward him. "Very few." That answer said everything. Someone inside. The pain in Adrian's shoulder no longer seemed important. Betrayal had a way of numbing lesser injuries. He looked back toward the ceiling, but instead of numbers, names, and routes, he heard a woman's voice. "Stay with me." Not frightened, exactly. Frightened and furious at once. The voice of someone who had every reason to walk away and didn't. His eyes narrowed slightly. "The woman," he said. Marco and Leo exchanged a brief glance. She was the one who pulled you out, Leo said. Paramedics confirmed it. Civilian, female. Left before we arrived. Adrian said nothing for a second. He remembered flashes. Cold air in his lungs. Broken light. Blood in his mouth. A face leaning over him. Pale and tense. Hair loose around her cheeks. Cheap coat. Shaking hands. A voice that spoke to him like his life belonged to her for those few minutes, and she had no intention of giving it back. What's her name? Nina Walker, Leo said. 29. No record. Works at Marlowe's Grill in Midtown West. Lives alone in Queens. Adrian absorbed that. Nina Walker. The name sounded plain. Almost too plain for the way it had settled into his head. She stayed until paramedics took over, Leo added. Then she left. Why? Marco almost answered, then stopped. Probably because there was no answer that would make sense to a man like Adrian Morelli. In his world, people stayed when there was money, power, advantage, leverage. They did not vanish from the scene after saving a man in a six-figure SUV. She didn't know who you were, Leo said finally. Adrian let out a humorless breath. Maybe that helped. Marco stepped forward with a tablet. We already started looking into her. Read it. Born upstate. Mother died years ago. Father gone early. No husband. No children. No criminal history. Consistent work record. Current job. Server and general support staff at Marlowe's. Quiet. Keeps to herself. Pays rent on time when she can. No obvious ties to anyone on our radar. Adrian stared at him. When you can, Leo answered. She's late sometimes. Small amounts. Landlord has filed notices before. Never pushed it to court. A small, cold anger moved through Adrian then, and it surprised him. The woman had dragged him out of a wreck with her bare hands, then gone home to overdue rent. He turned his head, wincing slightly. Did she get hurt? A few cuts. Bruising, likely, Leo said. Nothing major from what the police report shows. Police report. The fact that his life had passed through public paperwork irritated him more than the painkillers did. Send something, Adrian said. Marco frowned slightly. Money? Yes. Leo hesitated. A lot? Adrian looked at him with open impatience. Enough to change her month. Marco typed something into the tablet. And flowers, Leo added carefully, as if offering the most ordinary version of gratitude might somehow make this situation less strange. Adrian's expression did not change. Fine. Marco paused. Under your name? That earned him a look. No. By late afternoon, the money had been sent through a quiet intermediary, clean and untraceable. The flowers were delivered with a simple card. Thank you for saving a life. Nina Walker refused both. Leo was the one who brought the update. She sent the envelope back untouched, he said, standing near the foot of the bed. Wouldn't sign for the flowers either. Adrian looked up from the file he had been pretending to read. She what? She refused them. Why? Leo gave a small shrug. She told the delivery man she didn't help someone for money. For the first time that day, something close to genuine surprise crossed Adrian's face. He let the silence stretch. In another part of the city, men were likely already lying to him, measuring weakness, calculating how to finish what they had started. Yet the thought that stayed with him was not the attack. It was Nina Walker handing back money most people in her position would have taken without hesitation, not because they were greedy, because life was expensive, because pride did not pay rent. He thought of her voice again. You're not dying on this road. Not tonight. No fear in it by the end. Just command. Get me the restaurant, he said. Marco looked up. You want to send someone there? No. With respect, Adrian, until we know who cut the brakes, you shouldn't be moving around. Adrian turned slowly toward him. Bruised, bandaged, and still in a hospital bed. He somehow managed to look more dangerous than most men standing upright with a gun in hand. I didn't ask what I shouldn't be doing. Marco said nothing. Adrian's voice dropped. I want to know what kind of place she works in, who she deals with, whether she's being watched already, and I want eyes on anyone in our circle who knew my route last night. Leo nodded. Done. Adrian closed the file in his lap. And Marcus? Marco's eyes sharpened. Adrian only used his full name when he wanted precision. Yes. Stop looking at her like she's a loose thread. Marco said nothing for a beat too long. Then, you think she matters. Adrian's expression gave away very little. She pulled me out of a grave and walked away from the reward. At minimum, that makes her unusual. Leo almost smiled at that, but thought better of it. Adrian shifted carefully against the pillow, his body still stiff with pain. He should have slept. The doctor would have said so. Instead, he looked toward the darkening window and saw not the city skyline but the memory of cold pavement, a torn sleeve, blood on trembling hands, and a woman who had spoken to him like life was still an option. Most people approached Adrian Morelli wanting something: protection, money, access, fear, permission. Nina Walker had wanted only one thing from him: to keep breathing. That unsettled him more than betrayal did. The room fell quiet again as evening pressed against the glass. Somewhere below, traffic moved through Manhattan in slow ribbons of light. In another life, maybe he would have let the matter end there. Sent money, closed the book, called the debt paid. But that was not what this was. Someone had cut his brakes. Someone had known his route. Someone close enough to touch his world had reached for his throat and nearly finished the job. And in the middle of that, a woman with tired eyes and working hands had stepped out of nowhere and changed the ending. Adrian looked at Leo. Tomorrow, Leo straightened. Tomorrow, I'm done sending strangers. Marco's face tightened. Adrian, I said tomorrow. His voice was quiet now, which was worse than anger. I'll thank her myself. Neither man argued again. Night settled fully over the room. The machines kept their calm little rhythm. Adrian lay back, pain stretching through his ribs, and closed his eyes. But sleep did not come quickly. Each time he drifted, he heard her again. Stay awake. And somewhere deep beneath the pain, beneath the suspicion, beneath the old trained instinct to answer violence with more violence, one clear thought remained. He wanted to see Nina Walker in daylight. By the time Adrian Morelli walked into Marlowe's grill, the lunch rush had thinned, but the place still carried the tired warmth of a neighborhood that depended on routine. The bell above the door gave a short, dull ring. Inside, the restaurant smelled of coffee, grilled onions, butter, and the faint sweetness of pie cooling somewhere behind the counter. The booths were old red vinyl, cracked at the edges. Laminated menus stood in metal holders beside bottles of ketchup and sugar caddies that had been refilled 100 times by patient hands. Two older men sat near the window arguing over baseball like the season still had the power to fix their lives. A woman in a church coat stirred cream into her coffee while reading a paperback with the concentration of someone grateful to be left alone. It was the kind of place Adrian normally never entered, not because it was beneath him, because places like this required a different kind of honesty. In places like this, money could buy lunch, but it could not buy belonging. That had to be earned one visit at a time, one remembered order at a time, one ordinary kindness at a time. Adrian paused just long enough to take in the room. Then he saw her. Nina stood behind the counter with a pad in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. Her hair pulled back in a simple clip. A pale blue work shirt rolled at the sleeves. There was a fading bruise near one wrist, half hidden by motion. She looked smaller here than she had on the side of the road that night, not because she lacked presence, but because this place had taught her how to make herself unobtrusive. She moved quickly, efficiently, stepping around customers and tables with the quiet precision of someone long used to being needed and rarely thanked. For one brief second, Adrian simply watched her. She did not look like a woman who had dragged a man out of a crushed SUV with blood on her hands and fear in her throat. She looked like a woman carrying coffee to table 6 and mentally counting how many slices of rye were left in the kitchen. That unsettled him more than he expected. Leo had offered to come in first, to clear the room, to make the visit easier. Adrian had refused. He had left his bodyguards outside in a black sedan half a block away, against Marco's better judgment. He wanted to see her world before his presence bent it out of shape. Too late for that now. The woman at the counter looked up first, then one of the old men near the window, then Nina. The moment her eyes found his, she stopped moving. Recognition crossed her face first, then disbelief, then something closer to alarm. He understood why. In the bright light of day, Adrian Morelli was much easier to identify than he had been half dead on wet pavement. He walked toward the counter slowly, favoring one side just enough that a careful eye would notice the lingering damage beneath his coat. "Nina Walker?" he asked. Her throat moved as she swallowed. "You should be in a hospital." "Not exactly, thank you. Not exactly, hello." Adrian almost smiled. "I was," he said. A beat passed between them. Then Nina set the coffee pot down. "You shouldn't be here." He stopped a few feet away. "That's an interesting way to greet someone you saved." "I'm serious." "So am I." Her eyes flicked once toward the front window, then toward the kitchen, as if checking who might be listening. It was not fear for herself, he realized. Not first. It was fear of what trouble attached to him might do to the only stable part of her life. "I told them I didn't want anything," she said quietly. "I noticed. You should have left it at that." Adrian studied her face. No greed, no false modesty, no performance. She really meant it. "I came to thank you in person," he said. Before Nina could answer, a male voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Nina, table 4's been waiting 10 minutes. You planning to work today, or just stand there flirting with every man in a decent coat?" The restaurant seemed to shrink by half. A man in his 50s stepped out from the kitchen pass-through, tall in the sagging way of someone who had spent years leaning his authority against weaker people. His shirt sleeves were rolled too high, his tie loosened. His face flushed with the casual meanness of a man who mistook cruelty for management. Rick Dalton. He looked at Nina first, not Adrian, because men like Rick always aimed downward by instinct. "I asked for coffee 10 minutes ago." He snapped. "Mrs. Doyle over there needs her check. Booth 3 still hasn't been wiped. And if you've got time to stand around smiling at strangers, you've got time to find another job." Nina's spine went stiff. She did not look at Adrian now. She looked at the counter. "Sorry," she said. I don't need excuses. I need work." The room had gone quiet in the way public places do when everyone senses humiliation arriving and no one knows whether to intervene. One of the older men by the window frowned into his cup. The woman with the paperback turned a page too slowly. Adrian felt something cold settle into place inside him. He had seen men like Rick all his life. Different suits, different incomes, same appetite. They found the person least likely to strike back and built their authority there. Nina reached for the coffee pot again. "I said I'm sorry." Rick stepped closer. "You say sorry every week. Maybe what you need is a final warning. Maybe what you need is to learn you're replaceable." That was enough. Adrian turned his head and looked at Rick fully for the first time. Rick stopped. It was a small thing. Silence. But it moved through the room with force. "Is this how you run your floor?" Adrian asked. Rick straightened, trying to recover ground. "Who exactly are you?" "A customer," Adrian said. Rick gave a short laugh that carried no humor. "Then sit down, order something, and stay out of staff business." Nina's eyes widened just slightly. She knew, even if Rick did not, that there were men in this city who could ruin a life without raising their voices. Adrian Morelli was one of them. Adrian's tone remained level. "You humiliate your best worker in front of customers, blame her for delays while she covers half your floor, and threaten her job because she took 30 seconds to speak to someone." Rick scoffed. "Best worker? You know her?" "I know enough." Rick glanced at Nina with sudden suspicion, and that alone told Adrian more than he needed. This was not one bad day. This was pattern. Nina spoke quickly, her voice low. "It's fine." Adrian looked at her. "No, it isn't." Rick laughed again, harder now, as if mockery might restore his courage. "You got some kind of savior complex, friend? Because if she didn't tell you, I'll tell you this one is always behind, always distracted. She should be grateful I keep her here." One of the older waitresses near the register went visibly tense. Adrian noticed. "So she should be grateful," he repeated. Rick crossed his arms. "That's right." Adrian turned slightly toward the older waitress. "How long has Nina worked here?" The woman hesitated. Rick barked. "Janice, don't." Adrian never raised his voice. "I didn't ask you." Janice looked between them, then said carefully, 3 years. "Late often?" "No." "Dishonest?" "No." "Complaints from customers?" Janice actually looked offended by that. "No." Adrian shifted his attention to one of the busboys hovering by the kitchen door. When someone calls out, who covers? The kid swallowed. Usually Nina. Who stays late? Nina. Rick's face had started to change now. He understood, finally, that the room was no longer arranged around him. Adrian stepped forward once. Not threatening, not theatrical, just enough. Here is what's going to happen, he said. You will stop speaking to her like that. Rick bristled. You don't tell me what to do in my restaurant. Adrian's gaze did not move. That would be more convincing if half your staff didn't look relieved someone else finally said it. The silence after that was brutal. Rick looked around and saw what Adrian had seen from the beginning. Lowered eyes, held breath, old resentment. Power shows its true face in how it treats the powerless. Nina felt the truth of that line before anyone spoke it. She felt it in the room itself, in the way years of small humiliations suddenly stood visible in the open. Rick's voice hardened. Nina, if you want to keep your job, get back to work right now. Adrian reached into his coat, slow and precise, and placed a business card on the counter between them. Rick looked down. Whatever color remained in his face disappeared. Nina could not see the card from where she stood, but she did not need to. She saw the moment recognition hit, saw the fear arrive behind Rick's eyes, saw his whole posture collapse inward under the weight of a name. Adrian Morelli. Rick took a step back. I didn't realize. No, Adrian said. You didn't. He turned to Nina then, not gently, but with a kind of direct respect that was somehow more disarming than kindness. Do you know the books? He asked. She blinked. What? Inventory, payroll, scheduling. She looked genuinely thrown. Some of it. How much? I help when I'm asked. Janice spoke up before fear could stop her. She does more than help. She keeps half this place standing. Rick snapped. Be quiet. Adrian did not even look at him. You're done here. Rick stared. You can't just... I can. And the terrifying part was that everyone in the room believed him. Rick opened his mouth, closed it again, then tried one last weak move. She's not management material. Adrian finally turned his full attention back to him. That may be the first useful thing you've said. Rick frowned, confused. It tells me exactly what kind of man you are. Nina's pulse was pounding so hard she could hear it. She had expected gratitude, maybe a tense conversation, maybe trouble she would spend weeks regretting. She had not expected this. Adrian looked at her once more. Finish the lunch shift, he said. After that, we're going to talk. Nina found her voice. About what? About why a woman who can pull a man out of a wreck still lets someone like him tell her what she's worth. He turned and walked toward the door before she could answer. The bell rang again as he left. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then one of the old men by the window let out a low whistle. Janice looked at Nina with something like wonder, and Nina stood behind the counter, heart racing, staring at the door Adrian Morelli had just walked through, knowing with absolute certainty that the life she had entered this morning was not the same one she would be living by sundown. Nina finished the lunch shift on nerves alone. She moved through the rest of the afternoon as if the floor had changed under her feet. Orders still had to be taken. Coffee still had to be poured. Checks still had to be closed out with a smile that felt steady even when her hands were not. But the room had shifted. Janice kept glancing at her with open curiosity. The busboy, Tommy, dropped a stack of plates because he was too distracted watching the door. Even the regulars seemed to sense something had cracked open. Rick Dalton disappeared into the back office and stayed there for nearly an hour. That, more than anything, unsettled Nina. Men like Rick did not retreat quietly. They lingered, muttered, retaliated. Silence from him felt less like peace and more like the moment before weather changed. At 4:30, the lunch crowd gave way to the slow in-between stretch. A pale winter light slanted through the front windows, making the dust in the air visible. Nina was wiping down the counter when Janice came to stand beside her. You all right, honey? Nina gave a short, distracted nod. I don't know yet. That man, Janice said carefully. He wasn't bluffing. No, Nina said. I know. Janice folded a dish towel in slow, practiced motions. She was in her 60s, with sensible shoes, kind eyes, and the posture of someone who had spent most of her life standing through things she should not have had to stand through. She lowered her voice. Rick's been in that office making phone calls since he got back there. Voice like a wasp in a junga. That should have made Nina feel vindicated. Instead, it made her stomach tighten. She looked toward the closed office door. This is a mistake. Janice glanced at her. What is? All of it. Nina dropped the rag onto the counter. He came in here because I helped him one night. That's all. He doesn't know anything about this place. He doesn't know how things work. Janice let that sit for a second. Seems to me he knew enough. Nina gave a humorless breath. People like him don't do things for free. The older woman studied her with the patience of someone who had raised children, or buried a husband, or both. Maybe not. But that don't mean everything is a trap. Before Nina could answer, the office door flew open. Rick came out flushed and tight-jawed, his tie pulled loose even farther than before. He pointed at Nina without preamble. Back. Now. The whole room felt it. Nina's shoulders stiffened. I'm on the floor. Not anymore. You're not. Office. Now. Janice's mouth tightened. Tommy suddenly found something urgent to do with the sugar caddies. Nina dried her hands slowly on her apron and walked toward the back, refusing to let Rick see how hard her pulse was beating. She stepped into the office and he shut the door behind her with more force than necessary. The room was small, overheated, and smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. Rick stood behind his desk for a moment, both hands braced against the scarred wood. Then he laughed once, bitter and humorless. What exactly did you tell him? Nina frowned. Nothing. Don't play dumb with me. I'm not. He stepped around the desk. You think because some rich bastard in a cashmere coat walked in here and threw his weight around, you've suddenly got protection? Nina held his gaze. I didn't ask him to come. No, Rick snapped. But you sure looked comfortable when he started talking for you. A hot flare of anger moved through her. Quick and clean. Talking for me? She repeated. You've spent 3 years talking over me. Rick's face changed, not shock. Men like him rarely felt shock when the person they had pushed too far finally pushed back. It was more like insult. As if her finding a spine in front of him was a personal offense. You ought to watch yourself, he said. Nina folded her arms, not because she felt brave, but because it kept her hands from shaking. Maybe you should. He leaned closer. Listen to me carefully. Men like Adrian Morelli don't walk into places like this because they care about women like you. There it was. Not her performance, not the restaurant, her place in the world. Women like you. Nina felt the words land where Rick intended them to. On every late rent payment, every double shift, every time she smiled and nodded through humiliation, because keeping the job mattered more than keeping her pride. She had spent years making herself useful, quiet, easy to overlook. It had not protected her from men like Rick. It had taught men like Rick how far they could go. She looked at him evenly. I know exactly what kind of world he comes from. Do you? Rick said. Because I don't think you do. You think getting noticed by a man like that changes who you are? It doesn't. You're still just a waitress. 1 bad month away from losing that apartment. The cruelty was deliberate, precise. He had learned her weak places and kept them on file. Nina's throat tightened, but she did not look away. If you brought me back here to scare me, you're wasting your time. For 1 second, he looked almost impressed. Then there was a knock. Rick swore under his breath. What? Tommy opened the door halfway, pale and uncomfortable. He's back. Rick went very still. Who? Tommy blinked. Mr. Morelli. Silence dropped hard into the room. Rick straightened his tie out of instinct, though it did nothing to fix the fear already rising through him. Nina turned first, her pulse kicking again for a completely different reason. Adrian stood just beyond the doorway. He was alone this time too, though Nina had the sudden feeling that if she looked outside, there would be a car somewhere with men in dark coats waiting for a sign. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a black suit, and even standing still there was a kind of contained force in him, like pain had only sharpened the edges. His gaze moved from Rick to Nina and stayed there half a beat longer than necessary. Am I interrupting? He asked. Rick recovered badly. This is a private employee matter. Adrian's expression remained neutral. Then I'm sure you won't mind continuing it in front of a witness. Rick tried a smile that collapsed as soon as it formed. Mr. Morelli, if there's been some misunderstanding. There has, Adrian said. Yours. He stepped into the office. The room seemed to get smaller around him. Nina noticed then that he was still not moving quite right. Controlled, yes, but careful in a way men like Adrian probably hated. A slight stiffness through the ribs, a fraction of protection around one shoulder. He should not have been standing in a crowded restaurant office arguing about management problems, yet here he was. That did something strange to her. Not warmth, not yet, but a sharp awareness that he had come back when he said he would. Adrian looked at Nina. Do you know the ordering schedule for produce? She blinked. Yes. Payroll. I've seen it. Vendor accounts? Some. Staff availability? She hesitated. Better than Rick does. Tommy, still halfway in the doorway, made a sound suspiciously close to a cough covering a laugh. Rick shot him a murderous look. Adrian's mouth shifted, not quite a smile. Good. Rick stepped in quickly. Look, with respect, running a restaurant isn't some charity assignment. She's not trained for management. Nina almost answered, but Adrian lifted a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to signal he had this. It should have bothered her. Instead, against her better judgment, it steadied something in her chest. Tell me, Adrian said to Rick, how many times has she covered extra shifts this month? Rick said nothing. Adrian turned to Tommy. You, Tommy swallowed. 5, maybe 6. Who closes most nights when someone calls out? Nina. Who knows the regulars by name? Tommy didn't even hesitate. Nina. Adrian looked back at Rick. You have mistaken dependence for authority. Rick's face darkened. This is absurd. No, Adrian said quietly. What's absurd is that you've built this place on the labor of a woman you keep trying to convince she's lucky to be here. The words landed hard because they were true. Nina felt them in the base of her throat. A person can survive on pride for years, but not without being seen. She did not know why that thought came to her then. Maybe because for the first time in a long time, someone was looking directly at what she carried instead of what she lacked. Adrian reached into his coat pocket and set a folder on the desk. Rick stared at it. I bought the debt this afternoon, Adrian said. By tomorrow morning, ownership transfers through the holding company. Legal notices are already in process. Rick went white. You can't do that. I already did. The silence that followed was so complete Nina could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen outside. Rick looked at her, and whatever he saw there finally undid him. Not triumph, not vindication. Something worse. She no longer looked afraid of him. You set me up, he said bitterly. Nina's voice was calm when she answered. No, you did that yourself. For one moment, nobody moved. Then Adrian said, Turn in your keys. Rick stared at him, then at Nina, then back again. His mouth opened, searching for one last insult, one last way to leave a bruise behind. What came out instead was smaller than all his earlier cruelty. This isn't over. Adrian's gaze went flat. For you it is. Rick dropped the keys on the desk so hard they bounced. Then he pushed past Tommy and vanished down the hall. The office stayed still after he left. Tommy let out a breath and stepped back, wisely deciding the moment no longer belonged to him. Janice appeared briefly in the doorway, took one look at the room, and disappeared again with the expression of someone planning to tell this story for years. Then it was only Nina and Adrian. He turned toward her. You meant what you said, she asked quietly. About me running this place? Yes. She let out a disbelieving breath. You don't even know me. I know enough. That's not an answer. His eyes stayed on hers. You work. You don't complain unless pushed too far. People trust you. That's harder to teach than bookkeeping. Nina looked away first. The office suddenly felt too warm, too close, too full of consequences she had not asked for. This changes everything, she said. That's the idea. She gave a small, strained laugh. You make it sound simple. It won't be. She looked back at him then, really looked, at the bruised shadows not fully hidden beneath control, at the pain he carried without offering it to anyone else. at the strange steadiness in his face when he said hard things like they were facts instead of favors. "Why?" she asked. The question hung there between them, larger than the restaurant, larger than management, larger even than gratitude. "Why this much? Why me? Why now?" Adrian answered without softening his voice. "Because the night I should have died, you dragged me back with your bare hands. Because men like Rick count on women like you believing you deserve less. And because I don't like waste." It was the last line that nearly made her smile. Nearly. He took a slow breath, careful of his ribs. "You'll have help with the books. Training where you need it. No one's throwing you into the deep end for sport." Nina glanced toward the dining room, where the regular afternoon light still fell across familiar booths and chipped tables. The place looked the same. Her life did not. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "And if I fail?" Adrian held her gaze. "Then you fail honestly. That's still more than most people manage." For the first time all day, Nina felt something stronger than fear. Not certainty, not trust, but the beginning of a door opening. Outside the office, someone called for a coffee refill. A plate clattered in the kitchen. The old restaurant kept breathing, unaware that within its back walls, the ground had just shifted for good. Nina drew in a careful breath and looked at Adrian Morelli, the man she had pulled from death on a winter road, the man who had now walked into the center of her life and rearranged it with terrifying ease. "All right," she said. His expression did not change much, but something in it settled. "All right, what?" She lifted her chin. "I'll do it." And as the words left her mouth, Nina understood that stepping into management was not the real risk. The real risk was that for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen more than survival. The next morning, Nina arrived at Marlowe's Grill 40 minutes early and still felt late. The sky over Manhattan was the pale, exhausted gray of winter before sunrise. Delivery trucks were already double parked along the curb, and the city had that half-awake sound it carried before office towers filled and traffic lost its patience. Nina stood outside the restaurant for a moment, with her keys in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other, staring at the front window as if the building might explain itself to her if she looked long enough. Yesterday, she had been a waitress trying not to get fired. Today, she was the manager. The word still did not fit in her head. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The restaurant was quiet in a way it never was once customers arrived. Chairs still sat upside down on a few tables from the night before. The floor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and burnt coffee. In the kitchen, one of the refrigerators rattled like it was tired of keeping up. Nina set her coffee down, turned on the front lights, and stood there with her coat still on. For years she had learned this place from the edges, which shelves ran low first, which suppliers were late on Tuesdays, which regulars wanted toast cut diagonally, and which ones would complain if the pie crust got too dark. She knew where the napkins were stored, where the good pens disappeared to, which register jammed if you pushed the drawer too hard. But knowing how a place survived and being responsible for keeping it alive were not the same thing. A person can survive on pride for years, but not without being seen. That thought came back to her as she moved behind the counter and picked up the reservation book. Adrian had not said those exact words, but the feeling of them had settled into her anyway. He had seen too much too quickly. Not just her work, her exhaustion, her habit of apologizing before anyone blamed her. The way she braced for disrespect as if it were weather, that made her uneasy. It also made it impossible to pretend nothing had changed. By 6:30, Janice came in carrying her purse, a thermos, and the kind of practical skepticism older women used when life had taught them not to trust miracles. She stopped just inside the door and looked Nina over. "Well," she said, hanging her coat on the peg by the kitchen, "you look like somebody promoted against her will." Nina let out a breath that almost passed for a laugh. "That obvious? To me? Yes." Janice unscrewed the lid of her thermos. "To customers, maybe not. You keep your face together better than most." Nina glanced down at the reservation book in her hands. "I was up half the night. Worried? Thinking, that's just worry with paperwork." Nina smiled despite herself. Janice moved behind the counter and lowered her voice. "He coming back today?" Nina knew who she meant without asking. "I don't know." Janice studied her for a second. "That man's trouble. I know. Trouble with good shoes is still trouble." Nina gave a dry nod. I know that too. But knowing it and feeling prepared for it were not the same thing. The breakfast shift began in a blur. Coffee orders, egg plates, a delivery that arrived short on oranges. Tommy calling out because his mother had a doctor's appointment and needed the car. One regular wanting decaf and insisting no one in America made it properly anymore. Another asking where Rick was with a level of satisfaction he did not bother hiding. Nina did not have time to be afraid once the doors opened. That helped. She moved fast, checked invoices, reassigned tables, covered the register when Janice got backed up, and called the produce supplier with a firmness that surprised even her. When the man on the phone tried to brush her off until tomorrow, Nina heard herself say, "No, you'll fix it today. We've taken your late deliveries for months. That ends now." The words came out clean and level. She hung up and stared at the receiver for half a second afterward. Janice, passing by with a tray, gave her a look. There she is. There who is. The woman who should have been running this place 6 months ago. Nina shook her head. But something small and dangerous warmed in her chest. By 11, the lunch crowd rolled in. Construction workers from down the block, 2 women from a nearby church committee, a retired firefighter who came every Wednesday and tipped in exact bills folded flat. The restaurant filled with the usual sounds, silverware, coffee spoons against thick ceramic mugs, the steady swing of the kitchen door. Ordinary life. It was exactly the kind of thing Nina understood best. That was why she did not notice Adrian at first. He came in quietly, without men flanking him this time, without the force of yesterday's confrontation. He stood near the entrance in a dark coat, one hand in his pocket, watching the room before it saw him. He looked less like danger today, and more like a man who had not yet decided if he belonged anywhere he had walked into. Still, the room felt him eventually. It always would. Nina looked up from the register and saw him. Her pulse gave one hard, traitorous beat. He looked different in daylight than he had under broken headlights or in the tight heat of Rick's office. Controlled, always, but also tired. The bruising near his temple had faded to a dark shadow, and though he moved carefully, the effort he spent disguising pain only made her more aware of it. He walked toward the counter. "How's the promotion going?" he asked. Nina glanced at the line of customers, then back at him. "You really know how to make a quiet entrance. I've had to learn." That was not what men said about him in the world outside this restaurant, she was sure. Still, she nodded toward the coffee station. "You're in the way." Something almost like amusement flickered in his eyes. He stepped aside. "Sit," she said. "Booth in the back. I'll be there when I can." He looked at her for a second, as if taking in the fact that she had just ordered him around in her restaurant. Then he did exactly as she said. That unsettled her in a completely different way. Nina stayed busy another 20 minutes before she finally carried a mug of coffee to the back booth. He had not touched the menu. Of course he hadn't. Men like Adrian Morelli probably did not read laminated menus beneath humming fluorescent lights. She set the mug down. "Black, you look like someone who drinks coffee like punishment." He looked up at her. "Is that your professional judgment?" "It's my best guess." "It's correct." That should not have made her smile. It did. She sat across from him only after checking the room twice. Janice caught her eye from behind the counter and raised a brow so slight it could have been imagined. Nina ignored it. "How are your ribs?" she asked. "Still attached." That wasn't the question. Adrian wrapped one hand around the mug. "They hurt." The directness of that answer caught her off guard. Most men she knew hid pain one of 2 ways, through denial or temper. He had chosen neither. He simply stated it like a fact. "You shouldn't be out," she said, "and you shouldn't be carrying half this restaurant alone." "I'm not." He glanced toward the counter, where Janice was currently doing the work of 2 people with the patience of a saint and the expression of someone who had opinions about everyone. "No." Nina followed his gaze and sighed. "We're short 1 busboy and 1 cook's running late." "Problem?" "Everything's a problem the first week. And after that?" She looked back at him. "Then you call it routine and pretend not to mind." Something in that answer seemed to please him. He took a sip of coffee. "You're handling it. I'm surviving it. There's a difference?" She gave him a flat look. "For some of us, yes." That quieted him in a way she had not expected. Not offended. Thoughtful. Outside the booth, plates moved, chairs scraped, voices rose and fell. But inside that small space, the noise seemed to settle at the edges. Nina broke the silence first. "Why are you really here?" He did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "To see if yesterday was a mistake." And? No. The answer came too fast to be polite. She looked at him carefully. "You decide things quickly." "I usually have to." "Must be nice." His gaze sharpened slightly. "You think I don't pay for that?" Nina opened her mouth, then stopped. She had not meant it as an accusation, but the look on his face told her something simple and oddly disarming. Men like Adrian Morelli may have controlled rooms, routes, money, other people's fear, but control had a price, and he carried it like old damage. He set the coffee down. "I know what you think. That's dangerous confidence. I think you believe I walked in here, fixed one ugly problem, and now I'm waiting for the debt to come due." Nina held his gaze. "Isn't that how your world works?" For a second, neither of them moved. Then Adrian said, "Usually." Honesty from a man like him was somehow more unsettling than lies. Nina folded her hands loosely on the table. "I don't want to owe you." "You don't. That's easy for you to say." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she had been trying not to name since the road that night. Not softness. He was not a soft man, but there was a weariness in him that had nothing to do with broken ribs. The kind that came from too many years of never putting your full weight down anywhere. "You came back," she said before she could stop herself. Adrian's expression barely shifted. "I said I would." The answer should not have mattered. It did. Nina looked down at the steam rising from her own untouched coffee. "People say that all the time, and don't mean it." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I do." The words settled between them with more weight than either of them acknowledged. A waitress passed the booth carrying pie, and the smell of cinnamon and butter cut briefly through the coffee. Somewhere near the front, one of the older regulars laughed too loudly at his own joke. The ordinary warmth of the place pressed around them, and Nina had the strange thought that Adrian looked less dangerous sitting in this booth than he did standing in any room built for power. Not safer, just more human. That realization was its own kind of risk. She straightened slightly. "I called the produce vendor this morning." He lifted one brow. "And? I didn't let him push me around." "Good." I think he was shocked. "He'll recover." That made her smile again, unwillingly. Adrian watched the smile happen, and something unreadable moved through his eyes. Not possession, not triumph. Something quieter than that. Like relief. Nina noticed, and the awareness of being seen struck her with a force she was not prepared for. She looked toward the counter again, needing the interruption of work. "You can't keep coming in here like this." "Why not?" "Because people notice." "Let them." "That's easy for you to say too." "Nothing about this has been easy." The way he said it made her believe him. Before she could answer, Janice appeared beside the booth with a coffee pot in hand and the sort of expression older women wore when they had decided to rescue a conversation from itself. "You eating, Mr. Morelli, or just haunting my back booth?" Nina nearly choked on air. Adrian, to Nina's astonishment, looked up at Janice with perfect calm. "What do you recommend?" Janice poured him more coffee he had not asked for. "Meatloaf, if you've had a hard life. Turkey club if you're pretending you haven't." For the first time since Nina had known him, Adrian smiled without restraint. It changed his whole face. Not enough to make him harmless, but enough to make him look less like a legend and more like a man. Janice caught Nina noticing and hid her satisfaction badly. "I'll put in meatloaf," she said, then walked away before either of them could object. Nina shook her head. "She likes you." "No," Adrian said, watching Janice go. "She approves of me feeding properly. That's different." Nina laughed then, a real one this time, and the sound surprised both of them. When it faded, the booth felt quieter than before. Adrian looked at her across the table. "How much sleep did you get?" "Enough." "That means not enough. You ask too many questions for someone who doesn't like being questioned." "That's fair." She studied him for a second, then said, "This thing you're doing, coming here, checking on me, stepping in. What is it, exactly?" He did not look away. "I'm still figuring that out." The honesty of it caught her harder than any polished line could have. Nina sat back slowly, her heart moving in a rhythm she did not trust. She had known hunger, overwork, loneliness, and the blunt humiliation of being treated like she should be grateful for less than respect. She understood all of that. What she did not understand yet was what to do with a man who frightened the city and spoke to her as if her strength were the most obvious thing in the room. Outside, winter pressed against the windows. Inside, the coffee stayed hot. The back booth held them in its small pocket of quiet. And for the first time since the accident, Nina allowed herself to feel the shape of a truth she had been avoiding. Adrian Morelli had not just changed her job, he had begun changing the way she saw herself. And that, more than his name, or his power, or the danger that moved around him like a second shadow, was the thing that made him impossible to ignore. 3 nights later, Nina noticed the sedan for the first time. It was parked across from her apartment building when she got home. Dark, idling low, its windows too tinted to read. It might have meant nothing. In New York, people sat in cars for all kinds of reasons. Waiting on someone, taking a call, avoiding going upstairs to an empty apartment. But when Nina stepped onto the curb and looked straight at it, the engine cut on a beat too fast, and the car rolled away without its headlights for half the block before turning the corner. She stood there in the cold with her key in hand, her pulse suddenly unsteady. By morning, she had almost convinced herself she imagined the whole thing. Then someone cracked the restaurant's front window before dawn. It was not shattered, not fully, just a hard, spidering strike in the lower corner of the glass, ugly and deliberate. No theft, no break-in, no note. A warning. Nina stood inside the front door with Janice and stared at it while the first weak winter light came through the damaged pane. Janice crossed her arms. That wasn't kids. No. Any enemies I should know about? Nina let out a thin breath. Not until recently. Janice looked at her sidelong. You going to call the police? Nina almost laughed at that. Almost. The problem was not that she had no faith in the police. It was that faith had nothing to do with it. A cracked window in a neighborhood restaurant would become a report. Maybe a shrug. Maybe a promise to send someone by if it happened again. Meanwhile, she already knew the damage was not random. Tommy arrived 5 minutes later, saw the glass, and swore under his breath. Should I sweep it up? In a minute, Nina said. Put the coffee on first. People still need breakfast. Janice gave her a look. You are becoming management. That sounds suspiciously like an insult. It's not. Nina called the repair company herself and arranged for a temporary board if the new pane did not come by afternoon. Her voice was steady. Her hand was not. By 7:30, the griddle was hot. The coffee was poured, and the regulars had begun to file in with the same coats, same routines, same small complaints that made the place feel held together. Ordinary life had a stubborn dignity to it. Nina clung to that. She was at the register, balancing a vendor invoice against yesterday's receipts, when the bell over the door rang and Adrian walked in. He took one look at the front window and his face changed, not dramatically. Adrian rarely gave anyone the gift of a big, visible reaction, but something cold slid behind his eyes, and that was enough. Who did it? He asked. Nina did not look up immediately. Good morning to you too. He came to the counter. Who did it? I don't know. Do you think I'm going to accept that answer? She set the invoice down and met his gaze. I think you're going to have to. His eyes flicked once to the crack in the glass, then back to her. When? Before open. Anyone see anything? No. Police? No. A muscle moved in his jaw. Nina, what? She heard the sharpness in her own voice and did not soften it. You want me to panic? Shut the doors? Hide in the back because someone threw something at a window? Yes, he said. That stopped her. Not because of the word. Because he meant it. For one strange second, she saw past the control, past the tailored coat and measured tone, straight into the hard truth underneath. Adrian was afraid, not for himself. For her, that realization landed deeper than she wanted it to. She lowered her voice. I'm not shutting down because of one cracked pane. It won't stop at one. You don't know that. He leaned one hand on the counter, careful with his ribs in a way he likely hated that she noticed. I know exactly that. Janice reappeared with a pot of coffee, took one look at both of them, and made the wise decision to retreat without speaking. Nina stepped away from the register. "Come with me." She led him to the back booth, the one that had somehow become theirs without either of them agreeing to it. Morning noise moved around them, plates, chairs, the soft hum of regulars discussing weather and politics and cholesterol like these were the pillars that kept the country upright. Adrian waited until she sat. Then he said, "You had a car outside your apartment." It was not a question. Nina went still. "How do you know that?" "Because I had someone watching the building." Her eyes narrowed. "You had me watched?" "I had the street watched." "That is not better." "It is if it kept you alive." The words came out flat and clean, with no apology in them. Nina stared at him, anger rising fast enough to steady her fear. "You don't get to decide things like that for me." "Apparently I do, since you didn't even tell me about the car." She hated that he was right. Hated it more because part of her had not told him on purpose. Saying it aloud would make it real. Saying it to Adrian would pull the danger tighter into shape. "It could have been nothing," she said. "And the window?" Silence. A waitress passed their booth carrying toast. The smell of coffee and butter rose between them. The ordinary life of the restaurant went on a few feet away, and Nina had the sharp, almost painful awareness of how fragile ordinary things really were. Adrian lowered his voice. "Someone is testing the edges." "Of what?" "Of you. Of me. Of how quickly I react." Nina leaned back. "Then this is about your world." "No." He held her gaze. "It became your world when you pulled me out of that car." The truth of that hit harder than she wanted it to. She looked down at her hands on the table. Working hands. Dry knuckles. One small healing cut still visible near the base of her thumb from the accident night. They did not look like the hands of someone meant to be dragged into wars between powerful men. But life did not care what people were meant for. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked quietly. "Tell you what? How bad it is." Adrian did not answer right away. That was answer enough. Nina let out a breath that felt too thin for the weight in her chest. "You come in here, you help me, you buy the debt, you put me in charge, and all this time you know there are people out there who might come after me because of you?" "Yes." The bluntness of it burned. "And you just expected me to keep smiling through the lunch shift?" "I expected to handle it." She laughed once, a short, unbelieving sound. "There it is." "What?" "The part where you think handling everything yourself counts as protecting someone." His expression did not change much, but she knew she hit something. "I'm trying to keep you safe." "I know. That's the problem." He sat back slightly. "Explain that." Nina looked toward the damaged front window, where pale daylight still touched the crack like a finger on a bruise. "I've spent most of my life with too little money, too many bills, and men telling me what I should be grateful for. I am not moving through the world with my head down anymore. Not for Rick, not for some stranger in a car, not even for you." Something in Adrian's face sharpened, not anger, exactly. Recognition. She kept going. "If there's danger, then tell me the truth. Don't make choices around me and call it protection." Outside their booth, one of the older regulars asked Tommy for more cream. A spoon clinked against ceramic. Somewhere in the kitchen, the fryer hissed. Life going on. That was the sacred thing, Nina realized. Not safety, continuity, the right to keep living ordinary hours without being bullied out of them. Adrian rubbed a hand once over his jaw. "All right." The answer came so quickly she frowned. "That's it?" "No." His voice stayed low. "That's me listening." She did not know what to do with that. He looked at her directly. "My route was leaked the night of the crash. Very few people knew it. Someone inside my organization made that possible." Nina felt a cold line move through her spine. "I've been narrowing the list," he continued. "The closer you become to me, the more useful you become to whoever did it. The car outside your building and the window this morning confirm something I didn't want confirmed, that I'm leverage." "Yes." The word sat between them like a stone. Nina swallowed. "So what now?" "Now I move you somewhere safer." "No." He did not blink. "No? No." His voice cooled. "This isn't a debate. It is if it's my life." "Nina, no." She leaned forward now, meeting him with a steadiness she had not always possessed. "I will not leave my apartment, my job, and the first solid ground I've had in years because a man I've never met wants to send me a message." He may want to do more than that. Then tell me how to be careful. Put someone on the street if you have to, but don't ask me to disappear." Adrian stared at her for a long moment, and she had the strange feeling that no one said no to him this way. Not often. Not, and remained standing afterward. Finally he said, "Why?" Nina almost smiled at the simplicity of it. "Because disappearing gets easier every time you do it." That landed. She saw it land. A person can survive on pride for years, but not without being seen. Maybe the deeper truth was this. Once seen, a person could not bear being erased again. Adrian's eyes did not leave hers. "You think staying here proves something?" "No," she said. "Staying here keeps something." "What?" "My life." Silence held for a beat. Then Adrian said, quieter now, "Justice comes late to some people, but late is not the same as never." Nina looked at him, surprised. He gave the smallest shift of one shoulder. "My doctor said it to me once. Years ago. Different context. It sounded like a confession from a man who did not make many." Nina glanced toward the front, where Janice was currently pretending not to watch them while very obviously watching them. "I'm not asking for justice. You should. I'm asking for the right to stand where I've already stood." Adrian looked at her as if weighing not just the words, but the steel under them. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "You stay." Suspicion came first. "That easy?" "No." A pause. "Nothing about you has been easy." Heat moved unexpectedly into her face. She ignored it. "What happens now?" she asked. "I increase security. Quietly. You don't walk home alone. You call me if you see anything again. You tell me things the first time, not the third. And in return?" "In return," he said, "I stopped trying to move you like a chess piece." That was close enough to compromise that she accepted it. Before either of them could say more, a crash sounded from the kitchen. Nina was on her feet instantly. So was Adrian. They turned at the same time toward the back hall. Tommy came running from the supply area. Face white. "Fire!" he shouted. Not big, but someone messed with the fryer line. Nina's blood went cold. She ran. The kitchen smelled wrong before she reached it. Hot oil, scorched rubber, panic. One side of the fryer flared with a hard, ugly flame beneath the metal housing while Cook Ramirez yelled for the extinguisher. Janice was already dragging a towel away from the heat before it could catch. Nina grabbed the extinguisher from the wall, pulled the pin with shaking fingers, and discharged it low and hard until the fire choked out under white chemical spray. Silence hit all at once after the hiss stopped. Everyone stood breathing. Ramirez wiped a hand over his forehead. That line was cut. Nina turned. Adrian was in the doorway. One hand braced against the frame. Not from fear, but because his injured side had clearly protested the speed of following her. His face had gone utterly still, not still from calm, still from certainty. He looked at Nina across the powder-coated kitchen and said, "Now do you understand?" She did. The cracked window had been a knock. This was someone trying the door. Nina set the extinguisher down slowly, her heart pounding so hard it blurred the edges of the room. Then she looked back at Adrian Morelli and understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that loving her own life enough to fight for it now meant accepting one terrible truth. If she stayed beside him, she was choosing danger with her eyes open. By the time the fire was out and the kitchen aired enough to breathe again, Marlowe's no longer felt like a neighborhood restaurant. It felt like a message. Nina stood near the prep table with white extinguisher powder still dusting her sleeves, her pulse refusing to settle. Ramirez had shut off the gas line and was muttering in Spanish under his breath as he checked the damaged connection. Janice was herding the lunch crowd back toward calm with coffee, pie, and the kind of practiced reassurance older women used when panic threatened to spread faster than facts. Adrian remained in the kitchen doorway, one hand still braced against the frame. He had gone so still that he almost looked carved there, a dark figure cut out against the lighter hall. Nina had seen anger before, in Rick, in customers, in men on the subway after too many drinks. This was different. This was anger with discipline. Ramirez straightened slowly and looked at Nina. Somebody cut it clean. Not old damage. Not wear and tear. Nina turned to Adrian. He did not say, "I told you so." That almost made it worse. Instead, he pushed off the doorframe and came farther into the kitchen, each step careful in a way that told her his ribs were punishing him for it. "Everyone out," he said. Janice crossed her arms. "This is still my lunch shift, sweetheart." Adrian looked at her, and to his credit, his voice changed just enough to fit the room. 5 minutes. It was not a request. Janice studied him, then Nina. Something unspoken passed between the two women. Finally, Janice nodded once, muttered, "Fine," and shooed Tommy and Ramirez toward the dining room. When the kitchen cleared, silence settled hard. Nina looked at the cut line again, then at Adrian. "So now what?" "Now," he said. "You stop pretending this is a warning from a bored coward." She crossed her arms, less out of defiance than because her body had begun to shake now that the danger had passed. "I'm not pretending anything." "Yes, you are." His tone stayed low. "You're still thinking like this can be managed with a repairman and a longer walk home." She hated that the words hit as true. Nina leaned back against the prep table. "Then say it plainly." He held her gaze. "Someone close enough to know how to get at me is using you to push." The kitchen suddenly felt too small. Nina swallowed. "You keep saying someone. But you know more than that." Adrian did not answer immediately. That meant yes. She noticed everything when she was afraid. The faint tick in his jaw. The way he shifted his weight slightly to protect his side. The fact that he never once looked toward the dining room while speaking, as if his attention could shield the walls themselves. "Tell me," she said. His eyes stayed on hers. "There are very few men in my world who could have touched that brake line, leaked my route, and then reached this place without attracting attention. How few? Fewer every day." That's not an answer. A humorless breath left him. "It's the one I'm giving." Nina pushed off the table. "No. You don't get to keep me informed only when it suits you." "Not anymore." Something in his expression shifted. Not anger. Recognition again, as if he was seeing the exact point where fear in her had hardened into resolve. He spoke more quietly then. "There's a man named Victor Salerno." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Adrian said it made her remember it instantly. "He's been with me a long time," Adrian continued. "Long enough to know schedules, routes, business fronts, habits. Long enough to make himself seem inevitable. Trusted. Yes." The word landed heavier than the others. Nina thought of the cut gas line, the cracked window, the sedan outside her building. None of it felt random now. It felt arranged, patient, personal. "What does he want?" Adrian's mouth flattened. "My position, my authority, everything attached to them. And me?" He looked at her directly. "To him, you're proof I can be reached." The honesty of it should have hurt more than it did. Maybe because by now she already knew. Still, hearing herself reduced to leverage made something cold move through her. "A person can survive on pride for years," she said, more to herself than to him, "but not if somebody keeps trying to strip the walls off her life." Adrian watched her closely. "You want me to move you now?" It was not a question. It was a prediction. Nina stood very still. The answer should have been yes. A smart woman would have said yes. A tired woman. A woman with less to lose. But Nina thought of her apartment with the weak radiator and the cracked tile by the sink. She thought of Janice and Tommy and Ramirez and the older regulars who came in for coffee because routine held grief together better than silence. She thought of how hard she had fought to stop being invisible in this place. "No," she said. Adrian's eyes narrowed the slightest bit. "Nina." "No," she repeated. "You were right before. This isn't one cracked window anymore. It's more. I understand that now. But I am not giving this place up because one man wants to make a point. He may not stop at points. Then neither do I." For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and distant voices drifting in from the dining room. Adrian took a slow breath, careful again with his ribs. "You don't know what you're choosing." Nina looked at him steadily. "Neither did I the night I pulled you out of that wreck. I chose anyway." That landed. She saw it in the brief tightening around his eyes. Loyalty means nothing when it only exists in easy times. She did not say the line aloud, but she felt it there between them. Whatever this thing growing between them was trust. Attachment. Something more dangerous it would either hold under pressure or reveal itself as illusion. Adrian stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to lower his voice without lowering its weight. Then hear me clearly. If Victor is behind this, he won't come at you like Rick did. He won't posture. He'll wait, learn your habits, test your weak places, and strike where it hurts most. Nina's throat tightened. You sound like you know him well. I do. And you still kept him close? His face changed then. Not much, but enough. The sort of shift only a careful person would notice. Pain, but not the physical kind. In my world, he said, men survive by making use of wolves before the wolves make use of them. That sounds exhausting. It is. The answer came so simply she almost smiled, if the moment had not been too sharp for it. A knock sounded against the swinging kitchen door. Janice pushed it open halfway, peered in, and took one look at their faces. Well, she said, you two look like death at a church picnic. Nina exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing a fraction. Janice's eyes moved to the damaged fryer line. Repair guy's on his way. Lunch crowd's mostly calm. I told them Ramirez had a kitchen flare-up, and I've seen worse on Thanksgiving. Nina nodded. Thank you. Janice shifted her purse higher on her shoulder and looked at Adrian. You bringing more trouble into my restaurant, Mr. Morelli. At least have the decency to pay for dessert. Adrian, astonishingly, inclined his head. That seems fair. Janice gave Nina a pointed look that said, we are discussing this later, then disappeared back into the dining room. The moment she left, the heaviness returned, only quieter now. Nina rubbed powder from her sleeve. So, what do you do? About Victor? Yes. Adrian's gaze went distant for a second, the way a man's gaze does when he is no longer in the room but 3 moves ahead of it. I tighten the circle, change routes, feed false information, watch who moves. You set a trap. Yes, there was no drama in the word. No apology either. Nina thought about that. And if you're wrong, I'm not. The certainty in him should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, what frightened her was how calm he became when the conversation turned toward betrayal. As if this ground was more familiar than any other, she asked the question anyway. Why haven't you just removed him already? Because men like Victor don't fall alone. They pull threads with them. I need to know who else moves when he does. The logic was cold, efficient, terrible, and necessary, she realized. In Adrian's world, justice did not come dressed in clean language. It came in timing. There are wounds no court can see, but they still shape a life. She wondered suddenly what wounds shaped his. The thought came and stayed. What do you need from me? She asked. He looked back at her. Awareness. Nothing more. That's not true. A pause. Then, trust. The word landed harder than any threat had. Nina looked away first, toward the row of coffee mugs hanging over the prep counter, each one slightly different from years of breakage and replacement. Ordinary things again. Familiar things. The kind that could fool a person into thinking life stayed one shape if she worked hard enough. When she spoke, her voice was lower. I trust that you're telling me the truth about the danger. But I don't trust your instinct to decide everything alone. A faint, tired sort of understanding moved through his face. That's fair. Nina gave a short nod. Then here's mine. No more surprises. No more men on my street without my knowing. No more deciding where I live or how I move without telling me first. Adrian was quiet for a beat too long. Then he said, agreed. She blinked. That easy? No. A slight pause. You've made very little easy. There it was again, that dry edge that appeared only when the pressure loosened just enough. Nina hated how much she noticed it. From the front of the restaurant came the sound of a plate dropping, followed by Tommy's embarrassed apology and Janice's immediate, that's coming out of your fake baseball career. Life. Continuing. Nina breathed it in. Then Adrian's phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He took it out, glanced at the screen, and something inside him went still all over again. What is it? Nina asked. He did not answer immediately. He read whatever was in front of him twice, then lifted his eyes to hers. One of the false routes I put in play this morning, he said. Only 3 men knew it. Nina felt the air change, and he slid the phone back into his pocket with terrifying calm. The car sent to intercept it just moved. She stared at him. So it is him. Adrian's face had gone flat in that dangerous way again, all warmth banked down to ash and control. Yes, he said. Victor just told me where to look. Nina's pulse kicked hard, but underneath the fear, something else rose with it. Something steadier. The understanding that this story had crossed a line. The enemy was no longer unnamed, the betrayal was no longer theory, and somewhere inside that cold shift, she realized another truth as well. A house cracks differently when the damage comes from its own foundation. She looked at Adrian Morelli, at the quiet fury in his face, and knew the war had just turned inward. Victor did not come for Nina that night. That was what made the waiting worse. By closing time, Marlowe's had settled into an uneasy version of normal. The damaged fryer line had been repaired well enough to reopen the kitchen for dinner. The cracked window was covered with a temporary pane, and the regulars had gone home carrying leftovers and neighborhood gossip. But beneath the ordinary sounds of silverware, receipts, and coffee refills, tension lay over everything like a second layer of air. Nina felt it in every glance toward the door. Adrian had left 2 men outside in an unmarked sedan after the lunch crowd thinned. He had told her their names, Polly and Ben, because she had demanded that much. They never came inside. They watched the street, rotated shifts, and stayed far enough back not to turn the restaurant into a scene. It was his version of compromise. Still, the knowledge of them unsettled her. It also steadied her more than she wanted to admit. Around 9:30, Janice tied off her apron and came to the register with her purse over one arm. You going straight home? Nina glanced toward the window. That was the plan. Janice followed her gaze. With company. Apparently, Nina gave a faint sigh. Apparently, Janice rested one hand on the counter. Honey, I've lived long enough to know the difference between drama and danger. This isn't drama. I know. You don't have to prove anything tonight. Nina looked down at the receipts in her hand. It's not about proving anything. No? No. She lifted her eyes. It's about not letting fear decide everything before I do. Janice studied her for a moment. The way older women do when they are deciding whether comfort or truth will serve better. As usual, she chose truth. That only works if you stay alive long enough to make the next choice. Nina almost smiled. You and Adrian should start a club, Janice snorted. Lord help me. One of him is enough. She leaned in, kissed Nina lightly on the cheek in a way that felt almost maternal, then headed for the door. Before stepping outside, she looked once toward the dark sedan down the block, squared her shoulders, and left as if 2 armed men watching the street were no more unusual than bad weather. Nina finished closing an hour later. Tommy had already gone. Ramirez had left with a muttered goodnight and a promise to check the fryer again in the morning. The kitchen was clean. The register was balanced. The back booth, their booth now, whether she liked the thought or not, sat empty beneath the low light. For a moment she stood alone in the middle of the restaurant, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint traffic beyond the glass. Ordinary silence. She had spent half her life fighting for rooms like this. Small, unremarkable, honest places where work spoke louder than danger. It angered her that fear had found its way here anyway. Her phone rang. Adrian, she answered on the second ring. If you're calling to tell me not to leave the building, I'm already offended. His voice came low and controlled through the line. Are you alone? The question erased the last trace of humor from her face. Yes. Lock the front. Nina's hand tightened around the phone. Why? A beat of silence. Too brief to be hesitation, too heavy to be nothing. Do it first, he said. She moved instantly, crossed to the door, and turned the lock. Done. Back door? I'm heading there. She locked that one too, heart beginning to pound in deep, hard beats. What happened? One of Victor's men was seen near the block 10 minutes ago. Then he disappeared. The air seemed to thin around her. Near the restaurant? Yes. Nina turned slowly, scanning the dim interior, the kitchen hall, the storage area, the dark reflection in the front glass. Do you think someone's inside? If I thought that, I would already be through the door. That did not comfort her. What do you want me to do? Stay where you can see both exits. Don't open for anyone but me. Outside, an engine passed, then faded. The city felt too large and too close all at once. Where are you? she asked. 3 minutes away. That should not have mattered the way it did. Nina walked back toward the center of the dining room, phone still at her ear, every sense pulled tight. Chairs sat upside down on the tables nearest the front. The pie case had been cleaned and darkened. In the kitchen, the hanging pans gave off small, dull reflections. Adrian, I'm here. I hate this. I know. A person can survive on pride for years, but not without being seen. The thought rose again, strange and unwelcome. It was one thing to fear danger alone, another thing entirely to let someone hear it in your voice. Then something scraped in the back hallway. Nina went still. What was that? Adrian's voice sharpened instantly. She lowered her own without meaning to. I heard something. Where? Near storage. Move away from it. She backed toward the counter, every muscle pulled taut. Adrian. The sound came again. Closer this time. Not loud. Careful. Someone inside. The realization hit like ice water. Nina's gaze moved toward the knife block behind the counter. She did not think. She reached for the largest kitchen knife her hand found and held it low against her leg. I need you to listen to me, Adrian said. And now there was no control in his voice that did not contain fury beneath it. Do not try to be brave. Too late, she thought. The storage door opened. A man stepped into the back hall, dressed in dark clothes, face partly shadowed beneath a knit cap. Not one of Adrian's men. Not anyone she knew. He froze when he saw her standing there with the knife in hand, phone at her ear. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Then the man started toward her. Nina dropped the phone and ran, not toward the front, toward the narrow gap between the counter and pie case, forcing him to come around the long way. She heard him curse, chairs scraping as he lunged after her. Her pulse roared so loudly she could barely hear her own breath. He was bigger than Rick, faster too. She reached the kitchen door, shoved through it, and nearly slipped on the tile. The knife was still in her hand. She did not even remember deciding to keep it. Behind her, the man followed. Nina! Adrian's voice shouted through the fallen phone somewhere in the dining room. Distant now. She grabbed the first thing within reach, a metal tray from the prep counter, and hurled it backward. It hit the man in the shoulder. Not enough to stop him, but enough to slow him. He swore again and came on. Nina ran toward the side exit. Locked. Of course it was locked. She had done that herself. Her fingers shook violently as she fumbled for the latch. The man caught the back of her coat and yanked. Nina spun hard, more from instinct than skill, and slashed with the knife. The blade caught his forearm. He shouted and let go. For one wild second, both of them stared at the blood. Then his face changed. No more patience, no more testing. He lunged. Nina stumbled backward into a rack of clean pans, sending them crashing to the floor in a deafening metallic burst. He grabbed for her wrist. She drove her knee upward. Desperate. Not graceful. Catching him just enough to wrench one arm free, he slapped the knife from her hand. It skidded across the tile. Fear struck then, not the sharp, useful kind, but the deep animal kind. The man reached for her again, and the back door exploded inward. Adrian came through it with two men behind him, all speed and violence, and cold purpose. The attacker barely had time to turn before Adrian hit him, not with wild rage. With terrifying precision, the man slammed into the stainless prep table hard enough to dent it. One of Adrian's men pinned him an instant later, while the other kicked the dropped knife away from Nina's feet. The whole thing took seconds, maybe less. Then, it was over. Nina stood against the wall, chest heaving, one sleeve half torn, staring as Adrian seized the attacker by the front of his jacket and drove him back against the metal again. Who sent you? Adrian asked. The man laughed through blood. You already know. Victor. The name was not spoken, but it filled the room anyway. Adrian's face went utterly still. Loyalty means nothing when it only exists in easy times. Nina did not know why that line came to her then, only that the man in front of her, the one who had tried to reach her through fear, through sabotage, through the knife-edge moment of being hunted in her own kitchen, was proof of it. Adrian looked ready to break him apart. Nina, he said without turning. She realized he was asking whether she was hurt. I'm okay, she lied. That was enough to stop him from going further than he already had. Barely. His men hauled the attacker upright and restrained him. Blood dripped from the shallow cut on the man's arm, where her knife had caught him. Adrian turned then, finally, and looked at her. The room seemed to go silent around that look. Her hair had come loose. Her coat was torn. Fear still moved through her body in visible aftershocks. But she was standing. He crossed to her in 3 quick strides and stopped just short of touching her, as if contact might either steady him or undo what little control he had left. "Are you hurt?" "No." "You're shaking." "So are you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. For one beat, something raw passed across his face. Not weakness, something older, more dangerous. The look of a man who had come within inches of losing the one thing he had not meant to care about this much. There are wounds no court can see, but they still shape a life. Nina saw one then. Adrian drew one careful breath. "This ends now." She believed him, not because his voice was loud, because it wasn't. His men dragged the intruder out through the broken back entrance. One paused for instructions. Adrian gave them in a tone so low, Nina could not make out all the words, only the certainty beneath them. Then they were alone in the wreck of the kitchen. Metal pans lay scattered across the floor. The side table had been shoved crooked. The back door hung broken on one hinge, letting in a draft of cold night air. Nina looked at the destruction and finally let herself feel what had happened. He had come for her, not the idea of her, not the message, her. She wrapped both arms around herself and looked at Adrian. "He was going to take me." "Yes." The answer came without disguise. Nina swallowed. "And if you'd been 30 seconds later?" Adrian did not answer. He didn't need to. The truth sat in the room between them. Hard and merciless. A house cracks differently when the damage comes from its own foundation. Victor was no longer circling. He had stepped inside. And as Adrian looked at her in the cold light of that ruined kitchen, Nina understood with terrifying clarity that whatever came next would no longer be about warnings, windows, or fear. It would be war. The war began before sunrise. Nina did not sleep. She sat in the back booth at Marlowe's with a blanket Janice had pulled from the office and a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands, while Adrian's men secured the restaurant, replaced the broken back door with a temporary steel brace, and swept every room twice. The police were not called, not because what happened did not matter, but because Adrian had looked at the shattered kitchen and understood something with absolute clarity. Victor was no longer testing limits. He was moving for the kill. By 4 in the morning, Janice had arrived in curlers, fury, and a church coat thrown over her nightgown. She took one look at Nina, one look at Adrian, and said, "Nobody dies in my restaurant. Not if I can help it." Then she made eggs for everyone. Ordinary kindness had never looked more sacred. Nina sat at the counter while Janice moved around the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had buried enough pain to stop flinching at new trouble. Adrian stood near the window, phone in hand, speaking in low, measured tones to men positioned all over the city. Every word he gave was clipped, precise, and final. Routes, names, building access, financial records, Victor's fronts, Victor's known drivers, Victor's backup apartments. Adrian was not merely hunting a traitor anymore. He was dismantling the ground beneath him. When he ended the last call, Nina looked up. "You've decided." He met her gaze. "Yes." "To kill him?" The question stayed in the air. Adrian did not answer immediately. He glanced once toward Janice, who was close enough to hear and wise enough not to interrupt. Then, he looked back at Nina. "I've decided to end this." That was not the same answer. Nina stood, setting down the coffee. Her legs still felt unsteady from the attack, but fear had burned down into something harder overnight. "That man came into my workplace to take me." "Yes." "He used your trust to get close enough to do it." "Yes." She stepped toward him. "Then don't give him the ending he wants." Something shifted in Adrian's face. Victor wanted Adrian enraged, reckless, brutal in ways that would fracture his own house. A man like Victor did not only reach for power, he reached for moral ruin. If Adrian answered betrayal with blind bloodlust, Victor would lose his life and still poison whatever came after. Nina saw that truth clearly now. "Some men fear truth more than bullets," she said quietly. Janice, still at the stove, gave the smallest nod. Adrian's eyes never left Nina's. "You want truth. I want it to hold." He understood. Not mercy, not softness. Exposure. Proof. The kind of justice that stripped a man of the respectable lies he wrapped around ambition. By dawn, the first piece broke open. Victor had moved money overnight too much and too fast. One of Adrian's financial men, a quiet older accountant named Ross who had served the organization since before Adrian took full control, brought records to a warehouse in Red Hook where Adrian had ordered everyone he still trusted to assemble. Ross laid out shell transfers, burner companies, route changes, and security overrides. Enough to prove theft. Enough to prove sabotage. Enough to prove Victor had been building a shadow structure beneath Adrian's for years. The deeper wound was not that Victor had stolen. It was how long he had been preparing to replace. Nina came with Adrian despite every objection from every man in the room. No, Marco had said flatly when Adrian first allowed it. Absolutely not. Nina had looked at him without blinking. A man tried to drag me out of my own kitchen. I'm done being spoken around. Adrian had watched her then, and after a moment said, "She stays with me." Now she stood inside the warehouse office, coat buttoned tight against the morning cold, watching men with dangerous faces fall silent when Adrian entered. Some lowered their eyes out of respect, some out of fear, some, she suspected, because the room itself had changed. Betrayal had that effect. It made everyone's loyalty visible by contrast. Victor arrived 30 minutes later. He came in under escort, not dragged, because Adrian had wanted him brought in with dignity and tact. There were older rules at work here, not noble rules, but old ones. Let a man walk in under his own weight before you strip him of what he thinks makes him untouchable. Victor Salerno was in his late 50s, silver at the temples, elegant in the way men became when they spent years mistaking polish for character. His face was composed. Only his eyes gave him away. He saw Nina beside Adrian and understood immediately that the night's work had failed. "That's disappointing," Victor said. No one spoke. He looked at Adrian as if they were meeting over business, not treachery. "You always did let emotion cloud timing." Adrian stood at the far side of the office table, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "You cut my brakes." Victor's mouth tilted. "Eventually, you would have become vulnerable anyway." Not denial, Nina thought. Arrogance. Men like Victor did not lie when they believed power still protected them. "You sent a man into my restaurant," she said. Victor turned to her for the first time. "And there you are, the waitress." The insult no longer landed the way he intended. Nina felt that with almost physical force. Once, a word like that would have pressed on every old bruise in her life. Now it sounded like exactly what it was. A frightened man reaching for hierarchy because truth had already begun stripping him bare. "I'm the woman who lived," she said. Something flickered in Adrian's expression at that. Victor gave a small, contemptuous breath. He was never going to keep control once he started building his world around sentiment. Loyalty means nothing when it only exists in easy times. Adrian straightened slowly. "You were close enough to me to know better." Victor's face hardened at last. "I knew exactly what you were becoming. Weak. Distracted. A man who walked into diners and bought debts for women who made him feel human." There it was. Not just betrayal, contempt for humanity itself. Nina looked around the room and saw that others heard it too. Marco's face had gone to stone. Ross lowered his eyes. One older guard near the loading door shook his head once, almost imperceptibly, like a man attending the funeral of a principle he had once believed in. Adrian slid the file across the table. "Bank transfers, security overrides, route changes. Your man's statement from last night. Enough to prove what you are." Victor did not even glance down. "And what will you do with proof? Call the police? Hold a press conference?" The contempt in his voice echoed through the room. Adrian said nothing. Nina understood then what choice still stood in front of him. Not whether Victor deserved to fall. He did. The question was, what kind of man Adrian would be when it ended. She stepped forward one pace. "He wants you to become him." Victor laughed once. "No, sweetheart. I already know he is." Adrian moved before anyone else in the room breathed. He did not strike Victor. That was what made the moment so devastating. He turned instead to Ross. "Send copies of everything." Victor's expression changed. Ross nodded once. "Federal task force?" Yes. Victor looked from one man to the other, and for the first time something like real fear broke through his composure. Not fear of death, fear of exposure, fear of losing the story he had told about himself. "You'd hand over your own structure for her?" he asked Adrian. Adrian's voice was quiet. "I'd burn out rot to save what can still stand." A house cracks differently when the damage comes from its own foundation. Nina felt the truth of that all the way through her. Victor's restraint finally snapped. "You self-righteous fool. Everything you have was built in blood." Adrian stepped closer, face unreadable. "Yes, and that's why I know exactly what it costs." The room held still. Then Adrian nodded once to Marco. Marco and two others moved in. Victor fought then, but it was ugly and desperate, not powerful. A man stripped of control always looked smaller than his legend. They restrained him, took his phone, his watch, his keys, and every last illusion of elegance, one piece at a time. As they hauled him toward the far door, Victor twisted once to look back at Adrian. "This city will eat her alive." Adrian did not answer. Nina did. "No," she said. "Men like you just taught it how." Victor was taken out. Silence followed, dense and exhausted. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Ross cleared his throat and started gathering papers with the care of a man who understood history sometimes turned not on bullets, but on ledgers. By afternoon, word had begun moving in all the places that mattered. Victor's accounts were frozen or burned. His loyalists split quickly once the evidence surfaced. Some ran. Some switched sides. Some vanished into the city the way bad men often did when they sensed the weather changing. Adrian's power held, but not in the same shape. He had cut away a diseased part of it with his own hand. When he and Nina returned to Marlowe's that evening, the front window had been replaced. The glass was so clean it almost looked like no damage had ever been done. Janice was at the counter folding napkins with righteous energy. Tommy was restocking creamers. Ramirez shouted from the kitchen that if anyone touched his fryer again, he'd kill them himself. The place smelled of coffee, onions, and fresh bread. Life. Real life. Nina stood just inside the door and let it hit her all at once. She was still tired, still shaken, still aware, somewhere deep in her body, of how close she had come to being taken. But the restaurant remained. The ordinary world had not disappeared. It had survived. A repaired front window. Broken things can stand again. Janice looked up and sniffed. "You two done ending empires for the day?" Nina let out a breath that almost turned into laughter. Hopefully, Janice pointed a napkin at Adrian. "You eating?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. That earned him approval. Later, after the dinner rush, when the chairs were being turned and the lights lowered, Nina stood behind the counter checking receipts. Adrian waited in the back booth. Not like a king in exile or a man hiding from war, but like someone learning the shape of peace, one quiet minute at a time. She carried him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Adrian looked at her and said, "The night you pulled me out of that wreck, I thought you saved my life. I didn't know you were giving me a reason to live it differently." The words landed with the full weight of everything behind them. Glass on asphalt, cracked windows, kitchen fire, betrayal, fear, survival. Nina held his gaze. "I didn't know either." That was the truth. She had not known she was rescuing the future version of a man. She had only seen someone dying and refused to leave him there. Adrian reached across the table, slowly enough to let her choose. When she did not pull away, he took her hand. His was warm, scarred, steady now. Not safe, exactly, but honest. "A person can survive on pride for years," Nina said softly, but not without being seen. Adrian's thumb moved once across her knuckles. "I see you." Outside, the city kept moving, loud and restless, and unforgiving in all the ways it had always been. Inside Marlowe's, with the register balanced, the windows whole, and the coffee still warm after closing, Nina no longer felt like a woman standing outside her own life. And Adrian Morelli, seated across from her in the quiet back booth, no longer looked like a man entirely owned by the darkness he had built his name inside. They had not been saved because the world had turned kind. They had been changed because, in a hard world, Neither of them had walked away. This story reminds us that dignity can survive even in the hardest places, but no one should have to fight for it alone. Nina's courage shows that ordinary kindness can change a life, while Adrian's transformation proves that power means nothing if it is not used to protect the vulnerable. In the end, the story teaches that real love is not built on wealth or fear, but on respect, loyalty, and the courage to stand beside someone when the world turns cruel. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.